black, the aggressors. That is not the case.
Lord David Owen came to Bosnia-Herzegovina in August of 1992 to replace Lord Carrington as mediator for the European community and with a reputation as a hard-line critic of the Bosnian Serbs. But Owen quickly learned that Muslim forces routinely staged incidents to turn world opinion against the Serbs. Media reports, for instance, had accused the Serbs of targeting Koševo Hospital in Sarajevo.
The UN monitors actually saw a mortar crew come into the hospital in Bosnian government military forces uniform and fire over the Kosovo hospital into an area, presumably Serb. The mortar was packed up very quickly. Television crew arrived, set up in the grounds of the hospital. A few minutes later, retaliatory fire from the place where the mortar came, and of course landed on or near the hospital, all filmed on television.
Owen learned a strongly worded letter had been sent to the government of Alija Izetbegović by the UN commander in Sarajevo, General Philippe Morillon, stating, quote, "I now have concrete evidence from witnesses of this disreputable and cowardly act. I must point out to you the harm that such blatant disregard for the Geneva Convention does to your cause." But there was, in fact, little damage to the Bosnian Muslim cause, because the UN did not make the letter public.
When I said to General Morillon, who's, I think, exceptionally able soldier in every way, well, why don't you make this public? He shrugged his shoulders in a sort of Gallic way, and he said, we have to live here.
Such caution was warranted. There were 3 attempts against the life of General Morillon, which he attributed to Muslim forces. In his book, The Fall of Yugoslavia, BBC reporter Misha Glenny observed that the majority of UN and relief workers who had died in the conflict were the victims of the Muslim units. The Bosnian government was quick to understand that most of the world viewed them as innocent victims. Throughout the war, they used this perception to undertake offensive actions and then portray themselves as victims. Lord Owen and UN mediator Cyrus Vance found that their efforts to negotiate a compromise to end the conflict were undermined by the propaganda war that targeted U.S. public opinion.
In America, they have a press and a television presentation that is still cowboys and Indians, good and bad. They like to see things in simple terms. There's no doubt about that. And it's been helped by some very strongly motivated propaganda. There's a propaganda war as well as an actual physical war.
And then there were some spectacular events which made good television and which were used effectively to totally discredit and demonize the Serbs.
Psychological operations and psychological warfare are the dynamic elements of a psychological strategy. For want of a better word, this is image manipulation, of which propaganda is a big part. You also have agitation propaganda, which involves the actual creation of incidents to get media attention.
In the Bosnian capital Sarajevo this morning, a moment of terror, just seconds after Serbian mortar shells landed there. The mortar landed within yards of the presidential building where the British Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, was having talks.
But the mortar shells were not fired by the Serbs. French UN soldiers and a Canadian sergeant described the incident to Newsweek's military correspondent, Colonel David Hackworth.
The Minister of State for Great Britain was meeting with the president of Bosnia, and the minute the ceremony was over, they were rushed into a bunker, and it was mortared. And one sergeant said, I was watching the Muslims dropping the mortar shells down the tube as they were falling on the president, who was safely in a bunker along with his honor guard. He said the whole thing was orchestrated.
An orchestrated incident could not have happened without the participation of Alija Izetbegović. Just 4 days before, on July 13th, a Canadian UN soldier reported a similar staged incident in which a mortar shell killed several children and maimed others. The most important propaganda success for the Izetbegovic government took place on May 27th, just 3 days before a scheduled vote on sanctions against Serbia.
Blood was pouring down the main street of Sarajevo today. At least 20 men, women, and children were killed, more than 100 wounded, as shells rained down on civilians in the capital of Bosnia. The atrocity by Serbian troops sparked new calls for foreign help for the helpless in Bosnia.
Footage of this bloody event from Sarajevo's government-controlled TV station was provided to international news organizations almost immediately after it had happened. Before any investigation had been attempted, Serbs were declared responsible by news organizations from New York to Tokyo. The U.S. government, which was sponsoring a resolution in the UN Security Council to impose sanctions on Serbia, was particularly interested in blaming the Serbs.
Muslims are being killed in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this government has tried to demonstrate to the Muslim world we care about that and want to try to do something about it.
But were the Serbs really responsible? A wealth of evidence suggests otherwise. To begin with, Serb leaders were desperately trying to prevent a vote on sanctions and had persuaded Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev to negotiate a ceasefire the day before the Breadline massacre. Indeed, no shelling had been reported that day by the UN until the marketplace explosion. More importantly, the physical evidence failed to confirm the initial reports of a Serbian mortar shell. Dr. Borisa Starovic, the dean of the Sarajevo Medical Faculty, who treated victims of the Breadline massacre, wrote later in the American journal Chronicles, quote, "I found it very odd that there were no lacerations or puncture wounds on any of the victims. Neither were there any head or chest wounds, only trauma to the lower extremities. The wounds were obviously not caused by artillery shells. They were the result of pre-planted demolition charges." A classified report by UN Commander Satish Nambiar to UN headquarters in New York, obtained by the London Independent 3 months later, stated that the Breadline massacre and a number of other bloody incidents had in fact been linked to Muslim forces loyal to Alija Izetbegovic. Other details confirming a staged incident began to emerge as witnesses came forward. The announcement of free bread had been broadcast 5 times the previous day on the Muslim radio station Hayat. But when the crowd gathered the following day, they were left waiting for bread that never arrived, while Muslim officials blocked off the street, according to witnesses who were standing in the breadline.
Bili su pripremljena i sanitetska kola i televizijska i to je sve bilo režirano.
Witnesses also observed a 2-person television crew taking cover in a nearby doorway, the entrance to the publishing company Svietlost, just before the explosion in the breadline. They were in position to film the gruesome scene almost immediately.
There were suspicions because the media happened to be there. The street had been closed off, then it was open, the bread line formed, and then there was an explosion.
In fact, 3 major staged incidents would take place in marketplaces within a 2-block radius of the breadline bombing. Each would affect the international response to the war in Bosnia.
We've found in this particular conflict that these incidents occur invariably before a major decision is due to be made by the United Nations, by the European community, or by within the peace talks and something of that nature. So what we have is an incident in which a number of Muslims get killed, the Serbs are blamed, the peace process breaks down. So peace accords are never reached because there is always this incident to break up the momentum. Now, the Serbs have continually got the blame for this. The United Nations has continually responded by saying that these are staged incidents, but the United Nations report doesn't get the same impact as the original event.
Sanctions against Serbia would have an effect opposite of what the U.S. had hoped. The Bosnian Serbs intensified the war. Despairing of finding a political settlement, and with time working against them, the Bosnian Serbs were encouraged to use their military might to score a quick military victory. Muslim forces, on the other hand, would be encouraged to prolong the war as sanctions wore down the Serbs. Because they had troops on the ground in harm's way, The UN and the European community were anxious to settle the conflict in Bosnia through negotiations that would involve compromise. Serbs would have to give up land they controlled, and the Muslim-dominated government would have to give up their claim to rule the whole of Bosnia. The Vance-Owen Plan, which was negotiated in December of 1992, would have ended the fighting by an agreement to decentralize power into 10 administrative units that would be dominated by the different ethnic factions. Although Radovan Karadzic reluctantly agreed to sign the plan, the Serbs were unhappy with the fact that they were divided into isolated enclaves that would be hard to defend. But it was American opposition to the plan that undermined the UN and European diplomats repeatedly.
We were being accused of favoring ethnic cleansing and territorial aggrandizement, and here we were forcing the Serbs back by 39%. Now, I used to always say, give me an example of any plan that has rolled back an undefeated army that amount.
If the UN and the European community had been allowed to bring peace to Bosnia, these institutions would have been strengthened. There would have been less need for American influence and an American-dominated NATO. A European settlement of the Bosnian War would have helped Germany and France in their plans for a Western European Union, which would enable Europeans to defend themselves.
Vance-Owen was not made in the United States of America. It was not made in USA. That the Clinton administration was coming in fresh with its own agenda, and the Clinton folks, would decide what was good for Bosnia-Herzegovina, for the Balkans, for the world. And I think that point of view pervaded the incoming Clinton administration.
Domestic politics in the U.S. also played an important role. President Clinton's future rival for the presidency, Senator Robert Dole, had been an early supporter of Croatian Muslim and Albanian separatists.
I think whatever happens in Bosnia, a large part of the blame is going to be right on the doorstep of this administration, including Secretary Perry. And my view is when you just write off a nation, it's wrong.
The Bosnian Muslims could count on Dole to use his considerable influence to oppose administration policy in Congress. By the spring of 1993, the failure to back the Vance-Owen Plan led to savage fighting between Croat and Muslim forces in west-central Bosnia. In America, this fighting received little coverage because it did not involve the Serbs or fit into existing media categories of good and evil. Perhaps the most realistic peace plan to end the war was proposed in September of 1993, the Owen-Stoltenberg Plan, which would have set up 3 republics on the model of Switzerland. The capital cities of Sarajevo and Mostar would have been placed under UN control. The agreement was ready for the signing when Lord Owen learned that the Americans were encouraging the Muslim faction, headed by Izetbegovic, to hold out for an additional 4% of territory. Under pressure from the State Department's hardline faction, headed by America's UN representative Madeleine Albright, U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher assured Izetbegovic that he had American support in his refusal to sign the agreement.
The United States clearly sabotaged to the best of its ability any European attempts at reaching a negotiated solution.
The Americans, not alone, but certainly have been most significant, in my view, of preventing a settlement in the sense that they objected to the particular peace plans thus far. So we have in many ways lost opportunity for what would have been good peace plans.
In frustration, UN and European community negotiators invited the Americans to join the peace talks, along with representatives of a much weakened Russia, now dependent on Western aid. But bloodshed carried on as the Izetbegovic government continued to reject new peace proposals, despite favorable conditions for the Muslims. After all, with tacit American support, Muslim forces were increasingly receiving illegal arms shipments from Islamic states, particularly Iran, but also Turkey, Malaysia, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia. French UN soldiers reported to Lord Owen that American airdrops of humanitarian supplies in eastern Bosnia were often a cover to provide illegal arms to Muslim forces. Some European community monitors were also used to smuggle weapons. According to the German TV network WDR, one such monitor was Christoph von Betzold, who served as an intelligence agent of the BND directing special operations. One of the largest smuggling operations involved the use of mammoth American-made C-130 transport planes to bring weapons into the airport at Tuzla, another Muslim enclave which was given official status as a UN safe zone.
Our supposition was that an arms delivery had taken place and that given the difficulty of the operation and also that jet fighters had also been seen in the vicinity at the time, that the operation probably involved the United States in some way, and that at the very least it was probably an American-sanctioned operation. And indeed that was the gist of our reporting to New York.
They were definitely flying in small arms ammo, anti-tank weapons and ammo, and it was a regular shuttle.
Against overwhelming evidence to the contrary from UN and British intelligence sources, U.S. envoy Richard Holbrooke denied the involvement of the U.S. in the illegal arms shipments to Muslim forces at the airport in Tuzla.
The United States didn't do this. We couldn't have done it. If we did a thing like this, American law would require the president to inform Congress under the covert action notification laws, and it would leak, and it didn't happen. It never happened. If there were planes in Tuzla, and I've heard these same reports, they were certainly not American planes.
Holbrooke would later deny that the U.S. helped facilitate Iranian arms shipments to Muslims, despite detailed reports on these activities from the Los Angeles Times as well as European papers. The most important weapon for the Izetbegovic government remained the media. The establishment of so-called safe areas for Muslims, including Sarajevo, provided a trigger for Western intervention. There was nothing safe, however, about these areas. The Serbian residents of these enclaves had already been killed or driven off early in the war. Out of a population of 30,000 Serbs in Bihać, only 1,000 remained, according to reports of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Virtually all the Serbs in Gorazde and Srebrenica had been driven off or killed by 1993. Despite the safe zone designation, Muslim civilians could not be protected either, because these enclaves were never demilitarized. Indeed, with weapons smuggled in by Americans, Germans, and Islamic countries, local Muslim militias were encouraged to attack surrounding Serbian villages to provoke a counter-response from the Serbs. On February 5th, the Markale marketplace exploded, killing 68 people and injuring several hundred others in downtown Sarajevo. As the dead were being carted away for burial, the crucial question was who was responsible for this brutal act of terrorism. If the Serbs were responsible, an American-sponsored UN resolution gave NATO the power to bomb Serbian targets. The U.S. State Department was quick to blame the Serbs.
Frankly, it is very hard to believe that any country would do this to its own people, and therefore, although we do not know exactly yet what the facts are, it would seem to us that the Serb and the Bosnian Serbs are the ones that probably have a great deal of responsibility.
How are you, Mr. Dole? Nice to see you.
Senator Dole put pressure on the Clinton administration to act by declaring the Serbs guilty and visiting the ruined marketplace. But both NATO and UN sources obtained evidence that suggested Muslim forces were behind the explosion. General Charles Boyd, who directed NATO's intelligence, concluded that Muslims had staged the incident to force NATO into bombing the Serbs. Sir Michael Rose, the UN's new commander in Sarajevo, reached a similar conclusion. In the report made public, the UN stated that the mortar shell which exploded in the marketplace could have been the responsibility of either Muslim or Serbian forces. In his book, Balkan Odyssey, Lord Owen writes that a senior ballistics expert in Zagreb had studied the likely trajectory of the shell and indicated the trajectory was, quote, more likely to be 1,100 to 2,000 meters from the impact, and this would tend to indicate that the mortar had been fired from a Bosnian government position.
I was in receipt of privileged information, really, and I was not going to reveal what was the suspicion. But what I did want was the UN in New York to come under questioning about who was responsible for the bomb.
Owen, who was trying to force Serbs and Muslims to agree on a settlement to demilitarize Sarajevo, suppressed the report. He wrote later that the slightest public hint that the Muslims were involved in the Markala marketplace massacre would have led Bosnian government representatives to boycott the negotiations. NATO airstrikes on Serbs were temporarily avoided, but a public which had been kept in the dark about events at the Markala marketplace was left with the impression that the Serbs were guilty. This was a boon to advocates of intervention. Instead of a negotiated settlement to the Bosnian Civil War, hardline members of the Clinton administration began to prepare for a military solution.
Even though nobody who really looked closely at Markala from the UN blamed the Serbs, it was automatically subsumed into Serbian atrocities.
Using sticks and carrots, a shotgun marriage was arranged between the Croatian forces and the Bosnian Muslims, known as the Croat Muslim Federation. Croatian President Tudjman was promised that he would have American help in his efforts to seize the predominantly Serbian Krajina region, which was part of the UN-protected area, a bloody operation that was more than a year away. Croatia would also be given de facto control of Western Herzegovina. 2 months after the Markala marketplace explosion, the Bosnian government would have its first success in getting NATO to intervene against Bosnian Serb targets near Gorazde. With help from an American military advisor, Muslim forces launched attacks against 6 Serbian villages around Gorazde. When Serbian forces responded, American television broadcasts portrayed fighting around Gorazde as if it were an unprovoked attack on a safe zone.
The Serbs punished Gorazde throughout the day. At one stage, shells were raining down at the rate of 1 every 20 seconds.
Shells are now dropping at random into the city center. The hospital has taken direct hits on its roof.
There was a dramatic transmission from a ham radio operator supposedly based in Gorazde.
Upravo ovog trenutka bolnica se granatira iz 3 pravca, tako da više ne možete izbrojati broj granata koje padaju na bolnicu. Sve okolni objekti oko bolnice, stambeni objekti.
U.S. President Bill Clinton and Bosnian government Vice President Eyüp Ganic urged UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali to authorize airstrikes against the Bosnian Serbs. NATO airplanes did indeed launch a limited airstrike against Serbian targets. But further airstrikes were called off by Commander Michael Rose, who realized that Muslim forces had manipulated UN agencies with false casualty and damage reports. Instead of 2,000 people injured and 700 people killed, fewer than 200 people were injured. Instead of the hospital being destroyed, only 1 shell had passed through the roof. As he flew by helicopter into Gorazde following the fighting, Rose was asked about U.S. satellite reports that nearly every house in Gorazde was damaged.
Yes, practically every house in Gorazde has been damaged, but most of the damage to Gorazde was done in the fighting that had taken place some 2 years before, when the Bosnian government forces drove the Serbs from this town. And there were 12,500 Serbs at that time living here, and they were all driven off. The way to distinguish a house that's been damaged by fighting, where a shell has hit it, and a house that's been damaged by ethnic cleansing, is if it's got no roof, no doors, no window frames, and nothing in the house at all. And there are burn marks up it, and bullets spread around the walls. That is the house that's been damaged by ethnic cleansing. A house that's been damaged by shelling has a shell hole in it, and there are still people trying to live in that building with their furniture because they've got nowhere else to go. That's something you can't see from satellites. And of course, at that time, the international image of what had happened in Gorazde was very different from the reality. What was dangerous was that policies were beginning to be put together on both sides of the Atlantic about what we should do in Gorazde, but these policies were being put together on totally flawed information.
According to respected British military analyst Jonathan Ayal, the ham radio operators whose live reports were carried on American television networks were not even based in Gorazde. During the first year of the Bosnian War, by all accounts the bloodiest period of the conflict, the Bosnian government placed the number of dead at 17,000. Within just 2 months, however, Bosnian government officials began using a figure of 200,000 killed. This huge increase in deaths came in the dead of winter, when fighting had virtually ceased in the mountainous terrain.
I'm probably as guilty as most of using inflated numbers, although I had enough sense to abandon using numbers in mid-93.
In a groundbreaking article which appeared in the New York Times Sunday magazine in the fall of 1994, George Kenney criticized the way inflated casualty reports were used by most major news organizations.
A number of very high-profile journalists quickly picked up Bosnian government numbers and began to use them routinely. John Burns of the New York Times, Carol Williams of the LA Times, even John Pomfret of the Post, who's normally a very cautious journalist, got in on this after a certain period. So with these very well-respected journalists saying, okay, there have been 150,000, 250,000, 200,000, whatever, people killed, those were the numbers that stuck.
While the Bosnian government was using a figure of 200,000 deaths, International Red Cross observers on the ground were coming up with more realistic figures.
The International Committee of the Red Cross internally, and they've made it very clear that they're not going public with this, but their analysts were quite eager to talk with me and to be straightforward about their analysis. Their numbers are the lowest of any. They say 20 to 30,000 total with an upper limit of 35,000.
The figures now, it depends who you want to hear and believe. It's ranging around 300,000. Probably the truth of the matter is you'll be hard-pressed to find more than 30,000 graves. It's been exaggerated by that percentage.
Now, the European military intelligence would say, let's add in every possible hypothetical number of people that could be killed, and they get up to about 60,000. The U.S. intelligence community was sort of agnostic, saying the tens of thousands, but you know, they didn't want to commit to any particular number, even unofficially.
As the U.S. government began to more actively assist Muslim and Croat forces, British intelligence accused the American CIA of doctoring intelligence reports to justify American intervention.
The CIA did a report that said 90% of the ethnic cleansing had been done by Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We now know that that study was only done in areas now held by Bosnian Serbs.
Serbs who were expelled from Muslim and Croat areas were not included in the CIA report, even though international agencies stated that 40% of the refugees from the war were Serbian.
Unless one assumes that the vast majority of Serb refugees left voluntarily and were not victims of ethnic cleansing, there's a very large disparity in the figures.
The study itself does not represent what actually happened throughout Bosnia-Herzegovina because it was not done in the other areas.
To acknowledge that ethnic cleansing has taken place on all sides in the struggle would muddy the waters. It would cast doubt on the status, for example, of the Bosnian Muslims as pure victims and the Serbs as pure aggressors.
The Bosnian government also used highly inflated numbers for incidents of rape.
We are talking about rape camps in which 14 to 30,000 women were raped and are being raped as we speak now.
Newsweek reporter Alexandra Stiegelmeier used the same numbers, but acknowledged she had no evidence to back up claims that 30 to 50,000 women had been raped in Bosnia.
Do you believe the numbers are credible?
They seem very high to me. And I don't believe the sources because as I've investigated them, you get them, they always go back to one government or another.
A European Community Commission, which estimated that 20,000 women had been raped, dropped this claim from its final reports. After an exhaustive investigation, the UN concluded that 2,400 rapes had been committed by all three sides in the Bosnian conflict.
that we should not take sides in this war by becoming a combatant. And we have held firmly to that position, and we plan to continue to hold firmly to that position.
By the time U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry testified before Congress in June of 1995 that the U.S. was not taking sides in the Yugoslav conflict, a full range of secret military assistance operations to the Croatian government and Bosnian Muslim forces were already underway. At a remote airfield high in the mountains of the Croatian island of Brač, American intelligence operatives assembled the unmanned aviation vehicles, known as UAVs, for reconnaissance, while Croatian soldiers guarded the airport gates.
It was known within the UAV community who they were and where they were flying. When you suddenly ran into roadblocks and couldn't get information anymore, you knew it was the Tier 1 CIA guys that were operating. You could look at truck traffic, you could identify the types of artillery, the types of tanks, their movement. With this kind of information, you could literally analyze to extremely small detail the tactical capability of a force.
Only 1 month before Defense Secretary William Perry testified that the U.S. was not taking sides, a predominantly Serbian civilian area, supposedly under UN protection, was suddenly attacked by Croatian forces. Several UN soldiers were killed in what turned out to be a massacre of the Serbian civilian population of Sector West. Thousands of Serbian refugees fled across the Sava River from Croatia into northern Bosnia. Croatian sources put the number of Serbs killed in the attack at 1,000. Serbian Orthodox Church officials stated that 5,000 civilians were killed. But there was no criticism of this atrocity by American officials, including the killing of UN soldiers, because the U.S. was deeply involved in assisting the Croatian military. Efforts by British and French representatives on the UN Security Council to place sanctions against Croatia were repeatedly blocked by America's UN representative, Madeleine Albright. 6 months earlier, in November of 1994, the U.S. Departments of State and Defense had approved a contract between a group of retired four-star generals and the Croatian government.
The Croats paid for it, but they were authorized by the Pentagon.
I had constant reports of American officers who were, quote, retired, no longer in active duty, acting as advisors to the Bosnian government's military, acting as advisors to the Croatian military, and they were very active on the ground.
The retired generals, described as high-level mercenaries, belonged to a private company known as Military Professional Resources Incorporated, or MPRI. MPRI included such luminaries as Lieutenant General Ed Soyster, former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Major General Richard Griffiths, Deputy Chief of Operations in Central Europe, and most importantly, Karl Vono. General Vono and his colleagues at MPRI would be a major asset to the Croatian army in its efforts to forcibly expel the ethnic Serbian population from the Krajina, which was technically under UN protection in sectors north and south. But the destruction of Sector West, a UN-protected area for ethnic Serbs, would have consequences in nearby Bosnia. Lord Owen wrote that by acquiescing in the Croatian government's seizure of Sector West, the U.S. had, quote, in effect given the green light to the Bosnian Serbs to attack Srebrenica and Žepa. When Muslim paramilitary leader Nasser Oric launched an attack from Srebrenica against the Serbian village of Višnica, this time the surrounding Serbian forces counterattacked Srebrenica, entering the city.
It is well known, to anybody who has followed this, that Oric was launching repeated attacks out of a supposedly demilitarized zone against the surrounding Serbian areas around the Srebrenica enclave, to the point where, after repeated warnings, the Serbs simply could not allow him to continue to do that and decided to take the town.
Oric and several thousand of his soldiers fled across Serbian-held territory to the town of Tuzla, several days before Serb forces entered Srebrenica and Žepa. Muslim women and children in Srebrenica were placed on buses by Serbian forces and sent to safety in Tuzla. But between 1,000 and 2,000 Muslim men were captured by the Serbs, who blamed them for participating in a string of massacres led by Nasser Oric. A Croatian soldier who claims to have fought with the Bosnian Serbs testified at The Hague that he took part in the execution of 1,200 Muslims, although the number of bodies recovered from the site was 200. UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright, however, used greatly inflated numbers to describe Serbian reprisals at Srebrenica. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, thousands of Muslim men, allegedly missing, were found serving in Muslim army units near Tuzla. Washington Post reporter John Pomfret reported that 4,000 armed Muslim soldiers had escaped to a town near Tuzla. Yet these same soldiers were still being included in official reports years later as missing Muslims from Srebrenica.
Secretary Albright in particular was very insistent on using such numbers like 8,000, 10,000 Muslim men and boys who were executed in Srebrenica by the Serbs. There's simply nothing to document those numbers.
But an even bloodier episode, the Croatian army attack on the predominantly Serbian Krajina region, was yet to come. On August 1st, 1995, Croatian troops launched a massive assault on the Serbian population of the Krajina, sectors north and south.
It was an operation of about 100,000 Croatian military, yes. Tanks, planes, artillery, the works.
While officially denying any involvement in what the Croatians called Operation Storm, American forces were actively supporting this bloody operation of ethnic cleansing.
American equipment was used to jam Serbian communications at a critical moment so that command and control, at least in the communications sector, was blocked. And then there was a documented pair of raids on Serbian Krajina military facilities by U.S. Navy planes flying out of Aviano, which knocked out radar and other facilities.
The shelling of Knin was a deliberate terror bombardment meant to hasten the departure of the remaining Serbs, and it was, committed against an unarmed populace. They had street cleaners coming in and removing any evidence of the murders or the vandalism before they brought the cameras in to show the triumphant return of the Croats into Knin. So it was all very carefully planned.
Having denounced ethnic cleansing, American military planners helped Croatia carry out the largest ethnic cleansing of the war up to that point.
It would appear to be the largest single incident. If you count people affected in the first few days, it was 170,000 people.
That number quickly grew to 200,000 as a river of humanity clogged the roads. Recently retired U.S. General Charles Boyd, Deputy Commander of NATO, confirmed that the U.S. helped plan and implement the attack.
Croatia would not have taken its military offensives that it has taken either in Sector West or throughout the North and South, throughout the Krajina, without explicit approval of the U.S. government.
Roger Cohen of the New York Times quoted a Croatian military journalist who confirmed that General Vono of MPRI met with his Croatian counterpart repeatedly in the days preceding Operation Storm.
The tactics that they employed when they attack into the Krajina was exactly the same tactics that were used during Desert Storm. They were American doctrine, attacking on many fronts, with lightning-type attacks. And interestingly enough, the Croatian attack was called not Desert Storm, but was called Storm.
The way they deploy and employ their forces is a direct reflection of that training. So it's been very effective, and it's been very much a part of the official U.S. policy.
Canadian UN officers identified an ethnic Albanian commander, Agim Ceku, as responsible for the massacre of Serbian civilians.
Our officers, Colonel Leslie, General Forand, that were there on the ground, wanted indictments against the artillery commander in particular, the commander of the operation, and even wanted Tudjman, the Croatian president, indicted for his role.
Emma Bonino, refugee commissioner for the European Union, noted that as many as 10,000 Serbian civilians were missing from the stream of refugees who fled the Croatian attack on the Krajina. Many of these ended up in mass graves.
When you will go to the villages, you will see on the cemeteries the graves without any names. Mostly it's 90%. Sometimes when I'm thinking about what happened there, I think also about the role of the Americans in preparing of our army. So I really don't know how they educate our soldiers, but if it is the education for democracy, they educate very bad.
Well, I don't think that the American people have drawn that correlation of those incredible war crimes that happened recently in the Krajina and the fact that the Croatian army was trained and advised by and virtually almost led by former American military leadership.
They have, in fact, been accomplice to a massive ethnic cleansing of Serbs from Croatia who had lived there for many, many centuries. It was their home. I think we need to step back and be representative of principle because we not only deny our own principles that way, but we create more problems than we solve.
3 State Department sources told former New York Times reporter David Binder that the green light to undertake Operation Storm came from U.S. envoy Richard Holbrooke, who flew to Zagreb to meet with Croatian President Franjo Tudjman 2 days before the attack. At first, Holbrooke insisted that he tried to prevent Operation Storm, but in his memoir of the Dayton negotiations, Holbrooke acknowledged that he encouraged Operation Storm, which drove ethnic Serbs from their homes in the Krajina.
Read Holbrooke's memoirs. He writes he was encouraging the Croatian government in every way he could to move fast and hard to get them out.
Having blocked UN and European peace agreements to end the fighting in Bosnia, the Clinton administration encouraged a joint military offensive by Muslim and Croat forces in western Bosnia. Like Operation Storm, the offensive was designed to force Serbian civilians from their homes, the very ethnic cleansing the administration had once denounced. In his book, To End a War, Richard Holbrooke writes that he even advised Croatian forces which Bosnian Serb cities to attack. Those attacks produced nearly as many refugees as Operation Storm and an unknown number of mass graves in western Bosnia. The following year, after the Dayton Accords were signed, a mass grave of Serbian civilians at Mrkonjić Grad was unearthed. At the time of its discovery in 1996, it was the largest mass grave the war had produced in Bosnia. With Muslims and Croats on the offensive in Bosnia during the summer and fall of 1995, the U.S. military began to intervene openly against the Serbs. All that was needed was an incident in one of the safe zones. On August 28, 1995, yet another explosion occurred in the Markale marketplace in Sarajevo, killing scores of innocents and providing a pretext for NATO bombing. According to the London Times, French and British investigators determined that the shell came from Muslim-held positions in Sarajevo, but this time an American officer overruled their finding.
Now what's significant at this time is exactly within hours after this, NATO, this incredible air armada that was pulled back, cocked, locked, ready to go, the minute this, it was like it was orchestrated in part of a play. This mighty arm of NATO air launched forward and started attacking Serbian positions. They were waiting for that very excuse.
I have studied Markala 1 and Markala 2 for a long time and at the scene, and I've talked to a number of people who were involved in the investigations of both, and I am completely persuaded that those 2 explosions were caused by Muslim forces.
Bypassing the UN Security Council, which had the legal authority to act in Bosnia, the U.S. had already picked out Bosnian Serb targets, some of them supplied by Muslim commanders.
We entered a war, took the side of the Muslims, and became their air force bombing the Serbs on this supposed atrocity created by the Serbs, where everyone that was on the ground said it was created by the Muslims, which, by the way, is the oldest trick of war, and we fell for it.
Selective media coverage of the war had created tolerance, if not enthusiasm, for U.S. military intervention from the American public.
What amazed me was that American doves, liberals, my allies from the anti-Vietnam days, the sort of people I thought I could count on to oppose reckless American military intervention, were all screaming for military intervention. They were the biggest hawks of all.
For the Clinton administration, intervention in Bosnia represented a chance to justify the continuation of NATO and American dominance in Europe.
And NATO's great problem in the early 1990s was simply that the mission for which it was designed had come to an end. It was designed to protect Western Europe from an aggressively expansionist Soviet Union.
The logic would go, you've got to expand NATO, and the only reason to keep and expand NATO is to have a mission. Where is a mission? Bosnia, Balkans. The Balkans have become hostage to an American power concept, which is to keep Europe down and America up.
NATO was designed to protect the territory of its member states from a major mutual security threat. It was not designed to intervene, to project force into a civil war outside the NATO treaty area, and yet that is what it has sought to do as an agent of the United Nations, to complicate matters even further, in the former Yugoslavia. Not surprisingly, this has not worked out very well.
Senior military officers were amongst those most wary of administration policy.
I think the mess we have today is a result of political errors. I think we were all too quick to recognize these individual republics as they declared their independence and asked for recognition. We failed to think through the history of this region. And so it's a little strained to have that political context and then ask the military to go solve the problem.
We encouraged nationalism. We encouraged in the guise of self-determination. We never said to countries or to ethnic groups around the world that it's useful to have an idea larger than yourself or than your own language or your own religion in organizing a government.
Because the Dayton Agreement was achieved literally at the point of a gun, rather than by genuine compromise, it was inherently unstable, dependent on outside force to keep the Bosnian Serb and Muslim Croat republics from colliding under a central government dominated by Alija Izetbegović. To win the backing of Congress for deployment of U.S. forces in Bosnia in December of 1995, President Clinton promised that the troops would be back by December 1996, a month after his election. But 4 years after their deployment, U.S. troops remain in Bosnia.
NATO is an army of occupation, very much an army of occupation. It's not a peacekeeping force, it's an occupying force.
90% of the financial aid went to the Muslim Croat entity. Serbs were singled out by the International War Crimes Tribunal, whose staff was dominated by Americans. Yet, by the end of the war in Bosnia, a survey conducted by the U.S. Information Agency of Serbs, Muslims, and Croats reported that on a percentage basis, Serbs were more likely to have lost a family member during the conflict than either Croats or Muslims. The tribunal was controversial among legal experts from the outside because it was set up under the UN Security Council, where permanent members such as the US, England, and Russia could use their veto power to block investigations of their own military activities or those of their client states.
An international court, illegal in its conception. The Security Council has no authority under the UN Charter to create a criminal court. There would never been a UN if it had tried to establish that authority, because none of the powers in World War II would have abided by it for a moment.
But the United States, in its endeavor, because it was the country that pushed for the establishment of the tribunal. Madeleine Albright, then Ambassador Albright, was the single person most responsible, without any question, for the setting up, for the establishment of the tribunal.
Madeleine Albright, who would soon become U.S. Secretary of State, had repeatedly used the threat of a veto in the UN Security Council to block resolutions condemning Muslim and Croat atrocities.
I think it's clear that Madeleine Albright has not been impartial in her treatment of this war, She's been extremely one-sided, and in fact, so too have a number of people within the U.S. administration.
It's very clear that the United States was taking sides, that it was attempting to punish and criticize Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia for activities that it did not punish Croats for.
There have been complaints on the Serb side that we were less efficient in investigating war crimes committed against Serbs, which undoubtedly happened. One of the reasons it was difficult was the non-cooperation from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia.
But critics say that the War Crimes Tribunal failed to investigate well-documented reports by both the Yugoslav State Commission on War Crimes and independent human rights groups.
They've put an excessive emphasis on crimes against the Muslims and have been less willing than they should have been to accept evidence coming in from the Serbian side of atrocities against the Serbs.
In the eyes of some experts in international law, the tribunal used a double standard when it indicted Bosnian Serb leaders Radovan Karadzic and General Ratko Mladic for abuses committed by soldiers in the field, while failing to hold Muslim and Croat leaders, such as Alija Izetbegovic and Franjo Tudjman, accountable for similar abuses by soldiers under their command. In its first 4 years of existence, the ad hoc tribunal did little to prosecute well-documented atrocities by Muslim and Croat forces. No indictments were issued for Tomislav Merčep and Branimir Glavaš, who had been identified by Croatian police reports as leaders of death squads. Merčep serves as mayor of Vukovar, and Glavaš became the mayor of Osijek. Nasser Oric, the Muslim paramilitary leader who initiated the cycle of violence and retribution around Srebrenica, now runs a disco in Tuzla. In March of 1999, investigators for the tribunal recommended indictments for 3 generals who, 4 years earlier, had planned the bloody Operation Storm. But no indictments were issued against the American generals who advised them. According to New York Times reporter Raymond Bonner, the Pentagon refused to provide crucial evidence, aerial photos related to the targeting of Serbian civilians in the town of Knin. And no indictment was announced by the tribunal against the man who conducted the bloody artillery barrage against civilians in Operation Storm, General Agim Ceku, an ethnic Albanian who had served the Croatian army as commander of artillery. Ceku, who was linked to other bloody massacres in Krajina, would soon take a leading role in a new conflict, a war in the Serbian province of Kosovo. The Dayton Accords, which finally halted fighting in Bosnia, significantly changed the power base of Serbian President Milosevic. Because the provisions of the accord were unpopular among Serbs, the United States depended on Milosevic to enforce it. In turn, because of his increasing unpopularity in Serbia, Milosevic looked to his new working relationship with the United States to bolster his stature.
This was the first time the Americans were overtly getting involved into the whole Bosnia-Balkan situation, putting forward their troops in NATO into the region. They wanted it to work, and at the same time, the Serbs at home deeply resented Milosevic's policies. It had cost them West Slavonia, it cost them the Krajina, it cost them a third of Bosnia. They had thousands of soldiers and citizens dead. Their economy was in ruins. They had the sanctions against them, and they blamed Milosevic, who had proclaimed he could protect them or would do great things for them. Of course, he had been defeated, and they were protesting in the hundreds of thousands in the streets against his leadership and against his presidency.
For once, quarreling members of Serbia's political opposition put aside their differences and managed to win local elections in key cities, including Belgrade, Niš, and Novi Sad. They were ready to take on Milosevic in the upcoming campaign for the presidency of Serbia.
And at that time, they were looking eagerly for some sort of sign from the Americans to be able to push this over the edge, and they didn't get it.
In fact, unlike European governments which were shunning Milosevic, the U.S. sent 2 high-level missions to help bolster his stature as the guarantor of the Dayton Accords. Both Madeleine Albright, who had been promoted to Secretary of State, and Richard Holbrooke made official visits to Milosevic in Belgrade. When Milosevic manipulated election rules to guarantee his re-election, the opposition called a boycott. Richard Holbrooke, however, denounced the boycott, and eventually it fizzled. It was not the first time Milosevic used his presumed adversaries to help him maintain power. As early as 1992, during the Bosnian conflict, the U.S. cleared the way for Milan Panic, an American businessman of Yugoslav origin, to serve as Yugoslav Prime Minister. As Prime Minister, Panic quickly offered major concessions on policies towards the Bosnian conflict and began a dialogue with moderate Kosovo-Albanian leader Ibrahim Rugova. When Panic decided to challenge Milosevic for the presidency of Serbia, however, the Kosovo Albanians, who held the balance of power, continued to boycott Serbian elections, which left Milosevic in power, a convenient adversary in their goal of a separate state for Kosovo. But democracy in Serbia would be set back again, and Albanian moderates such as Rugova would soon lose out to an increasingly violent organization known as the KLA.
The German Secret Service played a very important role later in supporting the terrorist groups in Serbia.
German BND operatives trained KLA troops, picked their officers, and provided them with an arsenal of ammunition. In April of 1996, the KLA announced itself to the world through a series of assassinations of civilians and police in Kosovo.
Inside Kosovo, they clearly represented a modest-sized minority. I would estimate no more than 15 to 20% of the Kosovo Albanians supported the KLA. But they have international roots in Europe and America as well as in Albania, and over the years had developed funding, gathered arms, and they were not necessarily just attacking Serb police. They were killing civilian Albanians who did not support independence. They may have supported the government, or they may have supported Mr. Rugova's pacifist faction. They also were terrorizing the other ethnic minorities of Kosovo, the Gypsies, the Turks, the Gorani, Slavic Muslims, and others. They did this before the war, during the NATO air war, and they've been doing it again since the air war, nonstop.
After 2 years of terrorist incidents, the KLA was able to draw an armed response from the Milosevic government against KLA strongholds. As in the previous Yugoslav conflicts, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights would later report that human rights abuses were widespread on all sides, but both the media coverage and U.S. government spokespersons focused their criticism on the Milosevic government.
It is clear that no matter who was in government, the nature of this terrorist war conducted by the KLA was guaranteed to generate a strong police reaction.
Ruder Finn, which had profited handsomely by its wartime experience with Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, was chosen to handle public relations for the Kosovo Albanians. By the middle of 1998, as NATO approached its 50th anniversary without a clear direction or adversary, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was reported to be eager for a confrontation with Milosevic. She pressed President Clinton to bomb the Serbs.
So many of these decisions are driven by personalities and by the power struggles that go on within bureaucracies. Madeleine Albright, who obviously is the first woman Secretary of State, sees herself in a role where she has to be remembered as being tough.
As Madeleine Albright has said, if you've got all the military power, why not use it? If you can bomb and force people to do what you want them to do, why spend months of delicate diplomatic negotiation?
Instead, President Clinton sent Richard Holbrooke to meet with Slobodan Milosevic and leaders of the KLA, whom U.S. envoy Robert Gelbard had described as terrorists only a year previously. Under a demilitarization agreement, the OSCE, or Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was assigned to monitor the agreement.
The Serbian army did pull back to their barracks, that there was a de-escalation in the fighting, and there was a rather low-intensity struggle going on there. There was still some outbursts of fighting, primarily instigated by the KLA, but generally speaking, that the OSCE monitors did have a settling effect in Kosovo.
We had the opportunity, imperfect as it was, to work and to monitor and to seek a rational, logical, civil solution to the problems and the grievances within Kosovo. Kosovo was a political problem that could not be solved by NATO bombers bombing from 23,000 feet. This had to be solved through negotiations and diplomacy.
The head of the Kosovo OSCE verification mission, William Walker, was a controversial hardline U.S. diplomat who'd been criticized for his cozy relationship with the military government in El Salvador, where he served as ambassador. In Kosovo, his portrayal of a bloody battle at Račak as a massacre became the justification of the NATO bombing campaign against Yugoslavia.
If you remember Račak just a few weeks ago, where there were massacres, dozens of people with their throats slit, it has been a systematic expansion of this whole atrocities.
We've seen innocent people taken from their homes, forced to kneel in the dirt and sprayed with bullets. Kosovar men dragged from their families, fathers and sons together, lined up, and shot in cold blood.
Autopsies by 3 different internationally recognized forensic pathologists told a very different story. None of the victims, who were overwhelmingly men of fighting age, had had their throats slit. None were mutilated. Instead of execution-style killings, the men were shot from different angles. The Italian newspaper Il Manifesto reported that autopsies confirmed the presence of gunpowder on the hands of 37 men, a strong indication that the dead were soldiers killed in a battle, who were later dragged to the site by the KLA, which had contacted Walker.
Reporters from Le Monde and from Le Figaro were invited by the Yugoslav army to go into Račak. They did the morning before the massacre took place, or supposedly took place. There was no one in the village. It was a known KLA village. It had been the subject of Yugoslav army attacks before. When they went in the morning, there was only 1 or 2 very elderly Albanians in the village. But as they approached the middle of the village, the Yugoslav army units became under fire from the hills above. All that day, there was a fierce firefight in the hills. And in the evening, the Yugoslav army pulled out with the 2 reporters from Le Figaro and Le Monde. The following day, the OSCE with General Walker were invited back to the village and were shown a trench with 45 bodies in it. Now, the reporters on the scene said that there was no bloodshed around the trench. There were very few empty shell cases. They became immediately suspicious that this was a setup, that what was in the trench were bodies of the Albanian casualties of the fighting the day before. And they have reported it as such. But General Walker immediately went back and announced to the world that there had been a frightful massacre of Albanians.
Ironically, William Walker, who had been accused in the past of covering up massacres by the El Salvador government, was now suspected of transforming the story of a bloody gun battle into a civilian massacre at a crucial time for U.S. and NATO policies in the region.
Well, it's very important because I think everybody pretty well agrees that without the Račak massacre, there would have been no bombing of Yugoslavia.
The press coverage of the Račak incident strengthened the Clinton administration hardliners. Under the threat of bombing, the Serbs were now pressed by Secretary Albright to sign a document drafted by the State Department. This document, known as the Rambouillet Accords, would place NATO troops in Kosovo and effectively permit the Albanian majority to separate from Serbia through a referendum within 3 years. State Department insiders acknowledged later the Rambouillet Accords were drafted in a way that they expected the Serbs to reject. Publicly, we were seeking an agreement, said State Department Secretary James Rubin, but privately we knew the chances of the Serbs agreeing were quite small. To ensure that Serbs would reject the pact and to pave the way for NATO bombing, a new demand, Appendix B, was added by the United States, which gave NATO, quote, free, unrestricted passage, unimpeded access throughout the whole of Yugoslavia, including associated airspace and territorial waters. In other words, an open-ended occupation of the entire Yugoslavia.
If we look at the documentation and the ultimatums presented, we know that this was a disingenuous exercise in blunt, brute power. It was never a realistic proposal for peace.
They were never accords, they were a diktat to which the Yugoslav government nor any other sovereign state could ever agree.
The threat of force in negotiations, known as gunboat diplomacy, has been used in the past by major powers, including Nazi Germany, but legal experts observe that it was explicitly outlawed by the UN Charter following World War II.
The integrity of a sovereign state is not subject to attack by any other country that doesn't like it. You can't threaten it, you can't attack it. The launching of that kind of attack is aggressive war.
My fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo. We have acted with resolve. By acting now, we are upholding our values, protecting our interests, and advancing the cause of peace.
When the bombing started, I left. I decided that was it. I was getting out. I went back to Washington. I wrote a farewell message to colleagues in OHR saying that this was, if ever they wanted to unify the Serbs in support of Milosevic, they had just done it.
By that time, the Yugoslav military had prepared itself by deploying its troops in the field, hiding its major supplies, and preparing for a long air campaign, which had been part of their doctrine going back to Tito's falling out with Stalin. This was what they were prepared for, and this is why Yugoslavia, as small a country as it is, could stand up to this concerted aerial onslaught for 79 days.
I'm not sure NATO really had a strategy. I think that they had been led to believe that after 2 or 3 days of bombing, Milosevic would have caved in, which indicates pretty clearly to me they don't know very much about Serbian history.
Many fled the bombing, which pummeled all of Yugoslavia, but was most heavily concentrated on Kosovo. Others fled to avoid the fighting between 40,000 Yugoslav troops and 35,000 fighters aligned with the KLA. After the bombing began, Albanian communities which were strongholds of the KLA were targeted by Serbian paramilitaries.
I stayed with an Albanian family who had been, at one point they'd left, they'd fled their homes. They were in an entirely Albanian district. They said that it was about 4 or 5 days after the bombing started that some Serbian APCs had come up and had machine gun strafed the upper stories of the buildings. And no one had been hurt because everyone was in the basements from the bombing. And I asked him why, didn't they come door to door? I thought that was the story. And he says, are you kidding? They were petrified. He said the Serbs were petrified of the KLA.
Placed on the defensive by images of refugees fleeing, administration spokesmen claimed that they had intelligence from German sources that the Serbian government had planned to expel refugees even if NATO had not bombed, and that ethnic cleansing had been going on all along.
We were all told that Operation Horseshoe was in the wind and that this had all been planned long before NATO bombing.
After the war, however, German Brigadier General Heinz Lokai revealed that Operation Horseshoe was a sham. No such operation ever existed, he told the Sunday Times of London. OSCE monitors also discounted claims that ethnic cleansing had been going on before the bombing.
This notion of the justification of a war for humanitarian reasons is just blatantly false. The United Nations Commission for Human Rights recorded their first external refugee on March the 28th, 3 days after the air war started.
To protect their own pilots from casualties, NATO bombing took place at high speeds and high altitudes. This politically motivated strategy posed little threat to the Yugoslav military, but NATO bombs dropped from high altitudes would kill hundreds of civilians, including Albanian refugees in Đakovica and Korisha. At first, the U.S. Department of Defense tried to blame the Serbs, but reporters on the scene found cluster bomb fragments with British markings. The claim that NATO was targeting only military facilities was one of many falsehoods that were used to build public support for the bombing campaign.
They ran out of military targets within the first couple of weeks. And this is now common knowledge that NATO indeed expanded their targets to stage 3, which was civilian targets. They ran out of targets. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been hitting little bridges across rivers in Serbia on a Sunday afternoon or hitting marketplaces in Niš.
The plan was to first put pressure on the population and second to destroy Yugoslav economy so deeply, so intensively that Yugoslavia would have to bear for a long period of time to recover, and that it could recover only on the help from outside.
NATO bombs and missiles struck the foundations of the country's economy, destroying petroleum refineries and chemical and heating plants. These attacks left a trail of environmental devastation. The use of cluster bombs dropped from high altitudes in civilian areas had devastating consequences in population centers such as Niš in southern Serbia and Pristina, the capital of Kosovo.
I mean, I know there was a proliferation of cluster bombs used against Pristina, and there was all kinds of these empty casings that showed still clearly the American markings.
Scores of schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings were hit in what NATO described as accidents of war, but which were the predictable result of NATO's strategy of high-altitude bombing. Military experts say the methodic destruction by NATO bombs of a full passenger train clearly crossed the line between legal and illegal warfare.
The pilot had hit the wiring, which had immobilized the train, so it was a sitting duck, made a second pass, and it deliberately attacked the jammed passenger cars and basically murdered unarmed people. They weren't just targeting his military targets. When they're starting to take out police buildings in Belgrade, Foreign Affairs Ministry in Belgrade, the TV stations.
16 people were killed when the Radio and TV Serbia television station was struck by NATO cruise missiles.
They killed several technicians and cameramen and a makeup artist. Her hands were found over 100 yards away in a park. 2 people there, and this was late at night, were vaporized. None of their remains have ever been found.
A variety of reasons were given for destroying the civilian target, but NATO officials were clearly concerned when Radio and Television Serbia permitted international news media, such as CNN and CBS, to broadcast images of other civilian casualties to the U.S. and NATO countries.
When they began to make journalists a legitimate target, it became, truly an information war.
It was after that bomb that Yugoslavia allowed more reporters in and started to get more of the story out from its point of view. But it's also after that bombing that the International Criminal Tribunal issued its war crimes indictments against Mr. Milosevic and other key officials in the government.
Although the ad hoc War Crimes Tribunal is prohibited from taking instructions from individual governments, following a meeting with President Clinton, the tribunal's prosecutor, Louise Arbour, announced an indictment against President Milosevic and his military leaders. The timing of the indictment was controversial because the war still raged and there was little opportunity to gather reliable evidence.
The whole act was a very political one because nobody really could expect that Milosevic could be brought before a court. So it was nothing else than propaganda again, and to enhance the pressure on Yugoslavia and to influence public opinion.
It will help to deter future war crimes by establishing that those who give orders will be held accountable.
Would NATO leaders also be held accountable for violations of international law? Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights charged that NATO bombing had violated international law. According to Human Rights Watch, at least half the 500 civilian deaths attributed to NATO bombing could be considered war crimes.
The attack by a coalition of parties led by the United States, to me, is outright aggression. The Yugoslavs, the Serbs in particular, did not attack any NATO country whatever and didn't threaten any of them. They decided they were going to change policies in Yugoslavia and did it by military means. That is the first war crime. Second, in the bombing, although they were fairly cautious for the first couple of days in the targets they selected, ultimately they selected widespread non-military targets.
But the ad hoc Yugoslavia Tribunal, largely funded and staffed by NATO countries, failed to conduct a formal investigation of NATO actions.
Carla Del Ponte, the current prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal, has been forced to review some evidence and has come out with a finding that dismisses any further investigations for now. But the pressure has not been concerted because, again, this was a conspiracy of 19 NATO governments to bomb. And those governments are very like-minded. They know they have violated international law, but as long as they all stick together, they can maintain the appearance that they were doing this for truth and justice.
Bombs aside, the NATO war on Yugoslavia was also a war of words and numbers.
I think there's no doubt that our political leaders lied to us. President Clinton, Prime Minister Tony Blair were all talking about genocide taking place in Kosovo. Even by NATO's own figures, prior to the bombing, they estimated that there were a total of 2,000 casualties in Kosovo, Serbs and Albanians, which isn't, unfortunately, when we're talking figures of people being killed, they're all bad, but 2,000 is a pretty low intensity figure. The exaggeration of the figures continued during the war as a justification for the bombing.
We had a soccer stadium story right at the end of March, about the 30th or 31st. It was alleged that 100,000 Albanian men were already missing, and that they'd been jammed by the thousands into the soccer stadium at Pristina. And a variation of the story reported over 5,000 in another soccer stadium in Peć. An Agence France Presse reporter who managed to stay in Yugoslavia actually went the following day to the Pristina soccer stadium, found the infield grass in perfect condition, found the lone caretaker there who confirmed, of course, the place had been empty since before the bombing began.
NATO spokespersons announced that Albanian moderate Ibrahim Rugova and 4 other top Albanian officials had been executed by the Serbs.
Reliable sources report that, and you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, Firmi Agani, a member of the Kosovo Albanian delegation at Rambui, principal Rugova advisor and peace negotiator over much of the past year, was executed on Sunday.
All were still alive, however. Rugova was soon shown on Serbian television in discussions with Serbian President Milosevic.
The Western public were told that we were bombing in the name of humanity, that we had to stop genocide. But after the Serb army pulled out of Kosovo, and the forensic teams were the first to rush in, there have been very few bodies found. We'll never know how many people were killed, but the figures that NATO announced were highly exaggerated.
Instead of 100,000 dead or missing, after more than a year of digging later, the War Crimes Tribunal found 2,108 bodies, which included combatants and Serbs as well as Kosovar Albanians. Moreover, the total missing, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, is 3,368, a number which includes all ethnic groups in Kosovo. NATO's intervention ended in June with Kosovo under nominal control of the UN, terms that the Serbs had been willing to give them before the brutal bombing campaign began.
The United States was looking to punish Yugoslavia, was looking, I believe, to complete the process of wresting Kosovo away. And in the final essence, 79 days later, they weren't quite able to achieve that objective because Yugoslavia put up too much resistance, and there was enough diplomatic support for Yugoslavia among the Russians and Chinese that so far they have been able to obstruct the formal secession of Kosovo from Yugoslavia.
Almost a year after the bombing, Newsweek magazine obtained a secret report the U.S. Department of Defense had commissioned, which showed that the number of Yugoslav tanks and artillery destroyed by NATO was only a tiny fraction of the stated claims. Instead of 120 tanks destroyed, there were only 14. Instead of 450 artillery pieces destroyed, there were only 20. Newsweek reporters John Barry and Evan Thomas stated that NATO had been, quote, terror bombing civilians. Air power, they noted, was effective in the Kosovo War not against military targets, but against civilian ones. When the war concluded, Serbian units were compelled to leave Kosovo, but the Pentagon permitted armed units of the KLA to enter. There is little doubt that the Pentagon knew that this decision would enable the KLA to attack Serbs and Kosovo's other ethnic minorities. Pentagon briefers sought to prepare public opinion for new atrocities ahead.
I don't think that Kosovo is going to be a very happy place for Serbs when NATO comes in. I don't think Serbs will want to stay there.
I mean, I fled with Serbian refugees out of Pristina, so I know the terror that they felt. I was on a bus that ran the gauntlet of jeering Albanians. There was 700 or 800 of them that stoned the bus in full view of the British troops, who made no attempt to intervene whatsoever.
Under pressure from NATO, the UN administrator for Kosovo, Bernard Kouchner, appointed General Agim Ceku, who served as chief of staff of the KLA, to be head of the Kosovo Protection Corps. Cecu had been identified by senior Canadian military officials as a war criminal for his role in massacres in Croatia.
The KLA have stated their intention. They want an ethnically pure Albanian Kosovo, and if they're in charge of the security force, there's no question that there's going to be reprisals. There is reprisals, and that the head of this organization has proven himself to be a mass murderer.
What we see as the outcome is the KLA has managed to chase tens of thousands of gypsies out. The last Jews in Kosovo left very quickly. The Croatians have left, they being Catholic. Slavic Muslims and Turks are being chased out. And what it really is anybody who speaks Serb is either murdered or chased out. And everybody now understands this. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported that in January alone, 1,000 Turks and Gorani Muslims had to leave their homes because of KLA terrorism. And the United States has presided over the erection of the most intolerant society in Europe.
The Albanian refugees had returned with a NATO escort following the war, but nearly a year later, 250,000 of Kosovo's minority population had fled, including 2/3 of Kosovo's Serb population. Despite the attacks on minorities, NATO officials, including NATO Commander Wesley Clark, continued to work closely with Hashim Thaçi and Agim Cecu.
And I think there's no question that the Serbs, the Slav Muslims, the Gypsies have been cleansed out of Kosovo, and this has taken place despite the fact that there are 40,000 NATO troops in Kosovo.
In an attempt to remove any reminder of the Serbian presence in Kosovo since 700 AD, the KLA has destroyed or damaged 70 churches and monasteries. In 1 year of occupation by NATO, more religious artifacts were destroyed than under 600 years of Turkish occupation.
History is going to have to analyze very carefully the decisions that were made in leading us to that, what I consider to be an immoral, illegal, unconstitutional, ineffective, incomprehensible, indefensible policy.
By using force and taking sides in an ethnic conflict, NATO had drawn the wrong lessons from earlier conflicts in Bosnia and Croatia.
If the Europeans and the Americans et al., the United Nations, had not intervened in Yugoslavia, there would have been far fewer people killed, there would have been far less ethnic cleansing, there would have been some extremely unhappy and dissatisfied people who felt that they had been done out of their country or their livelihood or whatever it might be. But there were going to be a very large number of dissatisfied and unhappy people at the end of all this. And perhaps the moral of it all is that you should think very carefully before you intervene in a civil war.
I think it's very important for the United States to recognize that in ethnic and nationalist conflicts that you must, if you want to end wars and stop violence, you must be impartial. Because then you do not feed, by taking one side, you do not feed the nationalist dynamic and you do not lead to peace.
I think there's no question that Kosovo was an unnecessary war. It was an attempt to bomb Yugoslavia into submission. And I think that's what should be of concern to all people of the world these days, that we have the United States as a very powerful military force that no longer sees diplomacy and negotiation as worth their while.